So today we are joined by Luis, who was the project lead behind the book series for the website you're currently visiting. And I wanted to ask him a few questions about the project itself, if that's all right with you, Luis.
Absolutely.
Perfect. If you could start by quickly telling us a bit about the project, then I'll have some questions for you.
Okay, this is a very exciting project that started with an idea that we still tend to think very compartmentalized, and in a very compartmentalized way about issues of connectivity, of imaginaries, of order, power, and governance. And this was a concern that I've been having for some years. And I thought, well, let's break it down. Let's try to get an exciting group of scholars to think about these issues in a very particular way. And I conceived of the project as a trilogy of edited volumes, because edited volumes would allow us to get different scholars to share the work, and sometimes would be commissioned work for these books, but also enter in dialogue with the editors. So for this first book, I invited an editorial team, and it was, as you can see in the book, it was Suvi Alt and Martin Maya, who would bring different perspectives to what the whole problem of imaginaries of connectivity, order, power, and governance would be about. And it worked really well because we held an international workshop where we had a very exciting keynote speaker, Professor Ricardo Padron, who spoke to us about his latest work. But we also had a mix of scholars, some early careers, some seniors, some in the middle, coming from different disciplines, from different geographical countries, geographical areas, different cultural backgrounds, super important, with different languages as well. And that allowed us to have a very rich conversation. The second volume is the one that has recently been published. That was more targeted because it was about mapping connectivity and the problem of European empire. And of course, the selection of the authors in that book was a bit more targeted on the topic of mapping and the practice of mapping. And the third volume, which is the one that we're putting together now, is about navigation, connectivity, and the invention of global spaces. So as you see, the trilogy draws on the problem of connectivity and the creation of space from a perception of imaginaries of connectivity. That's what the whole trilogy has been about.
Wonderful. That's great. I wanted to ask you about exactly that, the cornerstone of the series, imaginaries of connectivity. Let's say you were talking to someone who hasn't heard this term before. How would you explain to them, first, the concept, and secondly, what this book series aims to achieve by investigating this concept?
So imaginaries and connectivity are two terms which are very difficult to define. They are not concepts as such. They're not stable ideas. They change depending on the context under which we're speaking of them. But in perhaps the best way to do so is resorting to a form of knowledge, which is metaphors. So I'm going to use a metaphor here to relate to this. When I say metaphor, I'm very much influenced by the work of Blumenberg, who actually wrote on metaphorology and made us reflect about how we come to think metaphorologically in our modern world in particular. But okay, the metaphor I'm going to bring here is that of contemporary outer space travel. So we know that there are various ventures. This is 2021 today, September, and there are various commercial ventures that are promising to bring people to outer space, mostly for tourist purposes. They're curious, they want to go there. They can pay the big money to go there, right? And it's becoming a phenomenon, outer space travel. Not long ago, we saw the announcement of Amazon having been able to go there. And imagine that in 200 years, some scholars decide to look into this phenomenon, and then they find maps of outer space travel, or probably tourist brochures of this tourist expeditions, and they start wondering about how is it they came to conceive of this project, and how strange that it was a private enterprise or a private commercial enterprise. And then they start wondering what made that possible. And then they start researching through various means, and they come to the conclusion that these were private ventures for profit. They were not to lose money. They were not just for the fun of it. They were there to make money and to make big money. But for that to happen, of course, you had to have some form of scientific knowledge in place, knowledge that was cutting edge, knowledge that in many cases had been provided and generated through public money and ended up being used commercially, privately. But you also had to have an economic system that favored that form of enterprise. We call it liberal capitalism these days. Some people call it neoliberalism these days as well. It's not exactly the same thing. We have a political regime with an economic system. But also you need to have such thing as enterprising spirits, right? People who are very ambitious to want to do what has not been done, or to do it in a way which has not been achieved so far. And you also have to have daring spirits, and you also need to have a particular network of marketing and communications, which is quite particular to our time, and. The reason I'm describing all this now is because this is the imaginary around which we will be able to understand the phenomenon of outer space tourism in this present time. Now, when I go and look at any case, any historical moment in history, there is always an imaginary or multiple imaginaries that we need to understand in order to make sense of the events that we're dealing with. Of course, we want to, if we were to look at the French Revolution from today's eyes, we would judge many of the actions as immoral, as impractical, as useless, as politically incorrect, etc. But if we understand that phenomenon, whatever that phenomenon was, under its own imaginary, we would realize that actually it's not for us to judge morally what the actions were and so on, but it will help us understand why certain events took place or not. By the way, I said French Revolution, but it was never seen as French Revolution when it happened. That's an ex post facto label that we give to phenomena, typical academic kind of labeling of situations, right? So that was the first part of your question. The second part of your question, if I don't remember wrong, was what do we expect to do with this kind of book, right?
Yeah, let me rephrase. Why are imaginaries of connectivity so very worthwhile to research currently? What makes them necessary in this day and age?
It's a very good question, because connectivity is something ubiquitous. Everything is connected and everything disconnects. We know that. Whenever we turn on the switch of the light and it goes off or on, we say, well, it's connected, right? It's wired. But under which terms? So some time ago, we would have copper wires, right? That would lead the current to the bulb or whatever. Nowadays, we have optic fiber for communications, and we have other kinds of materials, right? The kind of communications we achieve based on the difference in materiality matters. But we normally just look at the effect of the connectivity, or what I like to think of as the connectivity effect. So such thing as globalization, right? Very, very broad, or nationalism, or right-wing activism, and so on. We see that as the effect. But when we start wondering about what makes that connectivity possible, or under which terms is something connected or disconnected, we start realizing that it's not a simple process. It's a highly complex, very complex in its details and its ambitions, that it's almost like a miracle that things actually get connected or not. Let me give you a quick example here. The United Nations, we tend to take it for granted, or the European Union as an institution. We tend to take it for granted, but actually for it to be able to be, a lot of things have to be happening all the time. And sometimes we change the terms under which some of those things happen, and the effect is different. The connectivity effect that results from it is slightly different. So to think about imaginaries of connectivity is very important because it allows us to open up an empirical space from which we can understand the power relations that make those connections possible. A recent example is that of Donald Trump. Whatever idea we might have of his person or his administration, one of the things that he did since he started under his policy of America First was to disconnect the American state from many of its international obligations in agreements, organizations, associations, etc., and then reconnect America under different terms. So what he did was to reset the terms under which that connection would take place. So the free trade agreement with the Americans, for instance, between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, he cut it and then he remade it under different terms. Vladimir Putin is doing that all the time. Angela Merkel has tried to do it all the time. And effective politics is about that. Now, imaginaries of connectivity is an invitation to think in those terms, to understand that there's no real causality between A and B, because actually it's not about fixed variables, but it's about emerging phenomena, emerging ontologies, which we can understand from this perspective.
Absolutely, thank you. And I had some more questions, but I think you touched upon all of them rather well. And I think this is a very decent summary of the inspiration behind the project. So, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for helping us with this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right.